Well, I'm delighted to see you all here today, and I must say, and I think it's a very good thing, that on the whole, this is a remarkably adult audience. I'm not against people coming here for a little extra credit or as a result of encouragement by their professors, but I would gather that everyone here is here because they want to be, and I'm very, very pleased by that. It's very high quality type of audience. This is the beginning of the fourth set of events that involve commemorations of important things in Western civilization. So we've already completed 3, 2 in the spring semester of 2018 on the scientific revolution and on Shakespeare and his legacy, and 1 in September during Constitution Day, or the week of Constitution Day, on the Constitution and American civic culture. So this is the fourth and concluding. They've all been very interesting, and what they've been designed to do is to take a memorable event or person and bring together a variety of perspectives drawn from different disciplines. And that has turned out to have been a very interesting exercise, not only in combining ideas and perspectives, but also getting people together who don't ordinarily meet, members of the faculty. This final one, and I should say, by the way, that the entire series of events has been made possible by a very generous grant from the CH Foundation, for which we're very thankful. This final commemoration is of the Great War, World War I, which came to a formal end 100 years ago next Sunday. So this particular centennial commemoration is going to last, due to a variety of reasons, for somewhat more than a week. It's going to start today, and it will continue until November 29th. And it involves 4 lectures that will be given by members of the Texas Tech faculty, and if you want more details on that, they're all on this poster. And a lecture on Monday evening by one of the leading authorities on the history of the Great War, Jay Winter, who is recently emeritus professor, recently retired from the history department at Yale. His talk is entitled The Second Great War, 1917 to 1923. I said the Great War formally ended on November 11th, 1918, the famous day in which the guns fell silent, as people used to remark. But in point of fact, unlike the Second World War, which ended fairly cleanly, except in China, the First World War had a rather protracted, bloody set of aftermaths, some of which took place in Eastern Europe and Central Asia and the Caucasus, largely as a result of the Russian Revolution. Some took place in Turkey, big war between the Greeks and the Turks, and even in Western Europe, 2 successive civil wars, the Black and Tan War, and then the war between those who accepted the treaty with England and those who rejected it in Ireland. So there was a lot of messy, protracted, and very bloody mopping up, and that will be the subject of Dr. Winter's talk. We also have, as part of this commemoration, a mini film festival. I say mini because there are only 2 films, but they're both very good ones. One is Wings, which those of you who are film buffs may know was the first film ever to receive, for Best Movie, an Academy Award. I think it was in 1927. It's a silent film about aviators, American aviators in the First World War. And then that will be on November 13th, work. That's next Tuesday. By the way, popcorn and soda will be available for all those who come. And then on November 29th, it'll be the very last event of this series, we will show the famous 1930 classic, though it is a sound movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. They're both American films. We also have an exhibit of text related to the effort to sort of bring peace to nations. There are a variety of things, and they're to be seen. They're from the Remnant Trust, which is an archive of first edition and early edition classic texts that is now housed at Texas Tech. It'll be in the library. It should be there by Monday, if it's not already. And we have an essay contest, open only to undergraduates. So I think we do have a few undergraduates here. In order to be eligible for it, you have to come to Professor Winter's lecture. And then you have to, I think you'll have about 2 weeks to do it, write an essay of about 1,000 to 2,000 words in length, responding to, you can kind of run with the ball in any number of directions, but responding to the themes developed by Professor Winter. It'll be judged by 2 of the faculty members who are giving lectures during the week, and the winner will get a $1,000 scholarship payable toward their tuition. So if you're an undergraduate, think about that and come to Dr. Winter's lecture. So the first lecture is today's. And it's going to be, we're going to touch on different aspects of the Great War. And this particular lecture is going to look at its literary legacy. The Great War was truly called the Great War. Eventually, again, we changed its name to First World War, but it was the war that set the stage for the century that followed, and we still live in its shadow. There wouldn't have been a Second World War, there wouldn't have been a Cold War, there wouldn't have been a great many other things that now define our civilization and the world had there not been a Great War. Well, it had a big impact on literature, and in fact, it was the writings that followed it, and some of the films too, that shaped how people remembered it thereafter, and gave psychological depth to its impact, added psychological depth to its impact. And that's what's going to be the topic of today's talk. It's entitled Translating the Great War, World War I in Contemporary Literature. It's going to deal primarily with one recent novel that's been very important in the collective memory of the war and deals with an important aspect of the war. That is to say, the recovery of soldiers from the shock of having been in that terrible conflict in the trenches. This is a novel called Regeneration by an author named Pat Barker. And the talk will be given by our own Jen Shelton, who is is an associate professor in the English department, who has a special interest in the war and is doing a class on it this semester. Who has spent her career looking, among other things, at the works of James Joyce and at incest as a kind of metaphor for the structure of narratives and the kind of contest of narratives that often occur within novels. I suppose one can think of the First World War as a kind of murderous incest between the civilized countries of the Western world. But in any event, I have no doubt that this will be a very interesting way of kicking off our series. And without further ado, let me introduce you to Professor Shelton.
World War I, for most Americans, is the forgotten war. The one America joined at the 11th hour, the one started for reasons that seem fiddling and European to us, the one whose peace was unsuccessful, leading to the Second World War and the rise of Adolf Hitler, rather than to a long season of economic prosperity. But the Great War is an important moment in history and in literary history. The first truly modern war, World War I, saw the introduction of weapons and strategies that are still important in warfare today. The war was legendarily bloody. Combatant nations lost numbers of soldiers and civilians that are measured in percentages, such as the 16% of the population that Serbia lost. Those casualty tolls reflect the use of 19th century military tactics in conjunction with modern munitions. The Great War marked the moment when the world left the agrarian past utterly behind. The Great War was also a moment when English literature faced up to the demands of representing modern warfare. Notions of honor and glory, sorry, I should have turned that already. That's a picture by John Singer Sargent, an American painter. Now I'm on track. The Great War was also a moment when English literature faced up to the demands of representing modern warfare. Notions of honor and glory that sufficed for a poet like Alfred Lord Tennyson in the Charge of the Light Brigade no longer worked for poets, novelists, and memoirists trying to articulate the experience of modern warfare with its impersonal deaths and lack of opportunity for ostentatious heroism. For soldiers in the trenches, nurses at forward military hospitals, and civilians witnessing the decimation of their villages by the needs of the war for soldiers, stoic endurance rather than overt acts of heroism was the order of the day. Now, 100 years after the end of the Great War, we once again turn to the writers who engaged with the conflict and those who are still inspired today by the stories of the people who experienced the war. Those writers made possible the frank and emotionally complex writing we have come to expect in response to warfare, because they believed, in the absence of great themes of heroism, that the experiences of individual people who lived and died during the war were the real story that could be told. In focusing on individual experiences, they followed the modernist concern with consciousness, devoting their energies to exploring what Virginia Woolf termed the luminous halo that surrounds us from the first moment of consciousness to the last, rather than the gig lamps that Victorian writers had preferred. In the Great War, casualties from artillery shells, poison gas, and machine gun fire matched psychological injuries, with as many as 10% of frontline officers and 4% of enlisted troops suffering from shell shock, a striking increase in the rate of war-related psychological damage that coincided with the modern concern for the structure and functioning of the human psyche. At the Battle of the Somme, as many as 40% of casualties were shell shock victims, a rate that led citizens of the day to reevaluate the true cost of war as they contemplated the large numbers of soldiers without visible injuries whose normal functioning in society had nevertheless been compromised by their service. Today, we recognize shell shock as a manifestation of what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, a psychological injury that continues to affect troops and civilians both during and after experiences of warfare. Psychiatrists today have the benefit of World War I physicians' rapid growth in knowledge as they sought to understand the characteristic psychological injury of modern warfare. Among the doctors who provided the most humane and psychologically helpful insights into the condition are Charles S. Myers, whose 1915 article in The Lancet was the first scholarly description of shell shock, and W.H.R. Rivers, a Cambridge Don who served during the war in the Royal Army Medical Corps, working at a number of treatment facilities, but most famously at Craiglockhart War Hospital near Edinburgh, Scotland. Among his patients was great war poet Siegfried Sassoon. English novelist Pat Barker suggests that Rivers, the central figure of her Regeneration trilogy, starts off with the belief that traumatic experiences should be faced and articulated, not dwelt on obsessively, because that's going to the other extreme, but for part of every day, instead of trying insistently and deliberately to forget, you should sit down and deliberately remember. Her First World War novels enact this strategy, laying out for readers a set of clues to follow that allow remembrance and discovery of the history and literary importance of a war that continues to dictate how readers and writers think about war itself. World War I compels literary study because of the quality and quantity of literature produced by writers touched by the conflict. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg changed what writers could say about war and what readers expected and wanted from war literature. Novels including All Quiet on the Western Front offered realistic portrayals of soldiering and the war's psychological effects that made space for gritty memoirs while also raising public awareness of the long-term cost of war as measured by suffering among war veterans. World War I literature also intersects with debates about modernism and modernity in ways that help to illuminate an important movement in literary history. For all these reasons, studies in Great War literature have become a cottage industry. British school children all study Great War poetry extensively as part of the general school leaving exam. But for 21st century Americans, the war can seem so long ago. Even though the technologies of the war were more like our technologies than those of any preceding war, even though the war deployed airplanes and tanks instead of cutlasses and bows, we tend to think of the First World War as an antique production peopled by men in funny mustaches. To some extent, this is a function of the passage of time. Even an American my age is very unlikely to know someone, even indirectly, who fought in the Great War. It's also a function of America's late and limited involvement in that war, especially as contrasted to the Second World War, in which America played a much larger role. And of course, Americans tend not to think of the First World War as the first act of a larger confrontation that ended with the Second World War, a view that's common in Europe. In fact, American students don't get much grounding in what the war was about or why it continues to matter. Their high school history classes mention Archduke Franz Ferdinand, entangling alliances, and Wilson's 14 points, then move on to World War II, the good war. But all of us benefit from understanding the Great War's importance to literature as well as the war's historical importance. Pat Barker's World War I trilogy, published in the 1990s, helps students, teachers, and general readers bridge the gap between the historical realities of the Great War and contemporary sensibilities. Through examinations of Barker's source materials and how she deploys them within the novel, readers discover the rich world of Great War literature while simultaneously learning the history and ongoing meaning of the war. The events of Rivers's treatment of Sassoon are immortalized in the first novel in the series, Regeneration, which also provides a primer to the war for present-day readers who may not have read extensively in war literature. Because Barker holds herself to an ethical standard of accuracy where historical figures are involved, the novel tantalizes readers with tastes of authentic Great War texts, while also focusing the story in ways impossible for period texts that provide contemporary readers with a way in to the literature and history of the Great War. Regeneration is set at Craiglockhart, a former hydro spa repurposed as a psychiatric hospital for officers during the Great War. In addition to Sassoon, Wilfred Owen was among the famous patients there. Owen's first published poem appeared in The Hydra, the hospital's literary journal, which Owen edited as part of his therapy. Owen was a patient of A.J. Brock, who believed that work was therapeutic for shell-shock patients. Barker imagines the scene that led up to Owen's poem, Song of Songs, appearing anonymously in the same edition of The Hydra that featured a poem by established poet Sassoon, soon after he arrived at the hospital. In Barker's telling, the price of publishing Sassoon's poem is publication of Owen's. We know from Owen's letters home that meeting Sassoon was a watershed moment in his poetic life. As Barker notes, at the time Owen was admitted to Craiglockhart, he was writing poems with lines like, "My lady owed a stripling lad unto her privy page." After meeting Sassoon, Owen began to see the war as a legitimate subject for his poetry and to write in less formulaic ways as he sought to express the war as it was. He even tried to bring on nightmares as a way to connect to his own war experience because he said he had my duty to perform towards the war. Regeneration explores Rivers's work during the Great War, but it also uses important texts from the war, such as Edmund Blunden's memoir, Undertones of War, to uncover the experiences of soldiers in the trenches. It decenters the standard war memoir by locating its action at the hospital behind the lines rather than in the trenches, and with psychiatric patients rather than physically wounded ones. Because the hospital is in Scotland, not France, Barker can show the home front as well as the psychological cost of the war, and she can feature different stories from those we usually find in war memoirs, such as the story of Sarah Lum, a fictional munitions worker who meets the working-class officer Billy Pryor. Whereas war memoirs privilege the experience of soldiers who saw the war from the trenches, and often from the position of junior officers, Barker incorporates those experiences without making them the exclusive story of the war. In that way, she raises issues of class and gender that are part of the way we analyze social problems today, but which might be absent from a memoir concerned with troop movements. Thus, Barker helps translate the war for us, giving us entry points from our millennial subject positions, while remaining true to the authentic Great War texts. Setting her novel among shell-shock patients, Barker is free to explore the malady with late 20th century hindsight. She knows which treatment methods and theories proved themselves over time, and which were discarded. In writing a historical novel featuring real people whose lives are documented in letters, memoirs, and scholarly writing, Barker takes care to ground her fiction in historical reality as well as literary context, and it is these two features that make the book a great entry place for contemporary readers. Barker, in interviews, declares her preference for the discipline history brings to fiction. You can't say something terrible about Sassoon which is not true. Not that I've wanted to. You couldn't, because you're using the man's name. One can usually trace the provenance of plot details and even specific language in her text, and this detective work provides a way for readers to engage with the war and the writing it engendered. Carolyn Steffens notes that parts of the novel explicitly derive from Rivers's published writings, especially his case studies in books like Instinct and the Unconscious and Conflict and Dream. Barker also notes his anthropological work, using that as a way to develop Rivers's character within the novel as the detached yet empathetic observer who is able to question and understand his own cultural biases, as when he considers the cultural training that leads his patients to repress their war experiences to the point of neurosis, and notes that he too is a product of that culture of repression. Because Rivers's patients in the novels are all based on real people he treated, as described in his case studies, readers don't have far to seek to discover the originals of Burns or Anderson. Barker sends readers through her endnote to Rivers's 1917 lecture on treatment of war neurosis, as well as to his post-war case studies of shell-shock patients. Regeneration engages readers in the lives of real people who lived 100 years ago, by imagining them through the techniques of fiction, generating interest in the world of 1917, as well as in the history and literature of the war. Because important characters in the novel are poets, she intersperses her text with the poems Sassoon and Owen were writing during their time at Craiglockhart. But instead of printing for readers the completed poems in their published forms, she includes drafts from their hospital stay, in one case creating a conversation between Owen and Sassoon to provide the backstory for Sassoon's edits to Owen's poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth. This is a picture of that. And at the bottom, it says final draft with Sassoon's amendments. That's Owen's handwriting. It's not very easy to see because of the contrast, but the lighter handwriting in here is Sassoon's handwriting as they work together on the poem. The British Library has a draft version of this poem in Owen's handwriting with Sassoon's handwritten edits, so we know from documentary evidence that the two worked on the poem together, the older poet providing suggestions to help the younger one achieve one of his most important poems. In Barker's novel, Sassoon took the sheet and read the whole poem through twice, then returned to the first two lines. I suppose what you've got to decide is, who are these? The British dead? Because if they're British, then our guns is... Owen shook his head. All the dead. Barker dramatizes Sassoon and Owen working through the poem, Sassoon questioning Owen's choices and helping him articulate his vision while taking charge of the editing pen. This is a reading of the archival evidence that can send a curious reader back to the documentary material to understand more fully Owen's growth as a poet and Sassoon's role in that development. Helpfully, most of Owen's manuscript drafts, as well as his letters, have been reproduced in Oxford University's Great War Poetry Archive, where scholars and laypeople can readily view and study them. Owen's letters to his mother, such as his letter of August 22nd, 1917, demonstrate his hero worship of Sassoon and his pleasure at meeting him at the hospital. In this letter, Owen conveys the most momentous news that he has met Sassoon and regales his mother with an account of Sassoon's distaste for Owen's sonnets and greater affection for Owen's Antaeus, a poem written about a mythological story much loved by Owen's therapist, Dr. Brock. Again, as with the revision of Anthem for Doomed Youth, Barker's version of Owen and Sassoon's first meeting is drawn directly from Owen's letter, which readers can see in the published volume of Owen's correspondence or read in his own handwriting on the Great War Poetry Archive website. I always like to read it in his own handwriting better, right? Because handwriting says something too. W.H.R. Rivers, the protagonist of Regeneration, he's you see the guy in the middle, a nurse with some black stripes. She's the matron of the hospital, or the head nurse of the hospital. Next to her is Rivers in that blurry 1917 photo. Okay, so Rivers, the protagonist, is a very sympathetic figure who stands in for the audience in some ways, eliciting war stories from his patients, but like readers, essentially cut off from actual experience of the war. Barker mines his writings for stories she turns into patients, such as Burns, the officer promoted to captain at the unusually early age of 20, who was blown up by a shell and regained consciousness face down in the decomposing belly of a long-dead German soldier. In Rivers's 1917 lecture, he argues that the repression of emotion, a typical approach for men of late Victorian England, causes many of the symptoms labeled shell shock or war neurosis. There are few, if any, aspects of life in which repression plays so prominent and so necessary a part as in the preparation for war. The training of a soldier is designed to adapt him to act calmly and methodically in the presence of events naturally calculated to arouse disturbing emotions. It's a little understated. He writes, normal repression becomes a problem that creates war neurosis only when it fails to adapt the soldier for the demands of his life. Specifically, Rivers argues, soldiers who witness or experience trauma try hard, encouraged by doctors and others, to forget the traumatic events they have survived. From all sides, soldiers are encouraged to put the most significant experiences of their lives out of mind, attempting never to think about them and definitely never speaking to others about them. The result, Rivers says, is war neurosis, a condition that can be best addressed by encouraging sufferers to narrate their experiences. The transformation of Wilfred Owen at Craiglockhart from a poet who obstinately ignored the war into one of the most renowned Great War poets mirrors the shift Rivers suggested as the best way to help patients cope with the stress of war. Rivers's prescription, by the way, is not too far distinct from current methods of treating PTSD among military veterans. While anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications have become available since the First World War, psychiatric treatment of soldiers still depends, to a large extent, on encouraging them to narrate their experiences rather than repress them. Rivers's writings people the halls of Craiglockhart with patients who narrated their experience of the war to him, including an RAMC doctor who developed a fear of blood after a grueling stretch of work in a frontline casualty clearing station, and a patient who processed his relation to battle by preaching the consolations of theosophy in his own inimitable brand of pseudo-medieval English. Steffens notes that the majority of the first volume might be viewed as an adaptation of Rivers's text, arguing that ultimately Rivers's original case studies present crucial intertext for Barker's trilogy. The ease with which readers can discover the source text for Barker's work, then, both increases the sense that the novel is merely translating historical documents for readers and provides leads they can follow to explore the real history of the war. Contrasting with Barker's depiction of Rivers's treatment methods is her recounting of Dr. Lewis Yelland's treatment of shell shock. Yelland worked at the National Hospital Queen Square, a portion of which had been turned over to the treatment of shell shock patients, mostly enlisted men. Yellen's book, The Treatment of Hysterical Disorders of Warfare, lays out his strategies, which contrast sharply with Rivers's. The first case study he cites forms the basis for Barker's presentation of his treatment methods, which she quotes nearly verbatim. This patient, who had fought at Mons, the Marne, the Aisne, 1st and 2nd Ypres, Hill 60, Neuchâtel, Loos, and Armentières, in other words, in all the early terrible battles of the war, had become mute and had been treated before arriving at Queen Square by being tied to a chair and having strong electricity applied to his neck and throat, lighted cigarettes applied to his tongue, and hot plates applied to the back of his mouth. Yellen's treatment methods are not more humane. He applies an electric current to the man's pharynx, strong enough to cause him to jump back in the chair, disconnecting the electrodes. Yellen accompanied such treatment with strong suggestion. You will not leave this room until you are talking as well as you ever did. No, not before. Involuntary reflexes due to the electric shocks cause Yellen to tell the patient, remember, you must behave as becomes the hero I expect you to be. Barker's inclusion of Yellen's treatment methods help readers understand how unusual Rivers's humane practice was, as well as advancing Barker's analysis of class in World War I era Britain, since class largely determined whether soldiers suffering from shell shock went to Rivers for gentle conversation or to Yellen for disciplinary torture. Early in the book, Barker builds a scene upon Sassoon's poem To a Very Wise Man, a text about Rivers. In the poem, in a strange house I woke, heard overhead hastily thudding feet and a muffled scream. Barker translates this into, Sassoon woke to the sound of screams and running footsteps. The opening line clearly signals the source material Barker draws on in this passage. Having been alerted, readers can also note that the phrase quaking and comfortless at the end of the passage echoes Sassoon's I quaked uncomforted. Barker fills in Sassoon's gaps, imagining what he couldn't know, who was screaming and why. In the novel, fictional Billy Pryor, Rivers' most recalcitrant patient, brought the hastily thudding feet by his nightmare screams. Barker uses Sassoon's poem to set up an important conversation between Rivers and Pryor, introducing details of Rivers' work before the war, teaching basic psychological terms, and probing ways class plays into our understanding of the war. Pryor brings up the charge of the Light Brigade and reveals his ambivalent feelings toward the poem's glorification of lost causes and pointless sacrifice. And all that rubbish. I was in love with it once. The text moves from Sassoon's poem, the unnamed literary referent, to a named one that is rejected as inadequate for representing the experience of the Great War. But because Billy, not one of the upper-class officers at the hospital, articulates his love and disdain for the poem, readers understand British notions of honor and glory as fundamentally class-based. Much of the literature in the traditional canon of World War I writing, especially on the English side, is officers' writing. Sassoon, Graves, and Blunden were gentlemen who attended exclusive schools. Temporary gentlemen, like Pryor, were essential to the war effort. But as Pryor notes, despite that, class distinctions were plain for the informed to see. His statement to Rivers that it helps if your shirts are the right color, which is a deep shade of khaki, by the way, derives from Sassoon's account in his memoir of visiting a tailor to have his military uniforms made and receiving advice on the appropriate shade of shirting material for gentlemen. Sassoon, like Pryor, had instinctively chosen a lighter shade of khaki for his shirts, but unlike Pryor, he had been advised by a fellow public schoolman as to which tailor to commission, and the tailor was then able to steer him toward the upper-class signal. From the privileged position of Sassoon, an officer who would continue living as a gentleman after the war, this is an amusing tale of a near-miss social faux pas, as new gentlemen officers learned the code of the professional army. But for Barker, through Pryor, the incident provides insight into the pervasive class distinctions of British society. Barker's impetus for writing Regeneration came from her desire to understand her grandfather's war experience. As a child, she witnessed his bayonet wound scar and his paralytic stammer, both manifestations of his war experience that was otherwise marked by silence. Men of that generation did not talk about trauma, like Paul Baumer in All Quiet on the Western Front, who, home on leave from the front, sits beside his mother in near silence, thankful that she asks nothing. Thus, Rivers's clinical insistence on his patients narrating their experience provides a way for readers to explore and understand soldiers' experience of the war. A crucial source for Barker's novel is Edmund Blunden's memoir, Undertones of War. Blunden, a poet, joined the Army right out of public school and saw action in several of the most infamous sectors of the front, including Cambrai, being promoted to captain at just 20 years old, like the character Burns in Regeneration. In Undertones, Blunden enacts shell shock, writing with a blank affect of some of the most horrifying experiences in any First World War memoir. For him, the trauma is too close. All he can do is write down the bare facts, constraining his emotional reactions to the events he narrates. In fact, he diverts the narrative energy of his text into self-consciously literary modes when the feeling runs too high, deploying archaic language and obviously literary affect in order to distance himself from his own experience. Barker cannot use Blunden directly in her book because he was never a patient at Craiglockhart, but she takes some of the more terrifying moments of his memoir and attributes them to her fictional officer, Billy Pryor. Most significantly, she takes one of Blunden's memories from Cambrai of a soldier who was blown to bits while making tea, resulting in Blunden discovering his eye under the duckboards while helping to clean up the mess, and gives it to Pryor as the memory is so traumatic he cannot recall it without hypnosis. Blunden writes this scene with characteristically deadened affect, distantly asking, for him, how could the gobbets of blackening flesh, the earth wall sodded with blood, with flesh, the eye under the duckboard, the pulpy bone, be the only answer? Barker writes more emotively, playing up the horror of the incident. They'd almost finished when Pryor shifted his position on the duckboards, glanced down, and found himself staring into an eye. Delicately, like somebody selecting a particularly choice morsel from a plate, he put his thumb and forefinger down and through the duckboards. His fingers touched the smooth surface and slid before they managed to get a hold. He got it out, transferred it to the palm of his hand, and held it out towards Logan. What am I supposed to do with this gobstopper? In Barker's version, the elaborated detail helps readers understand the horror of the experience by providing narrative cues to emotion that we expect from fiction. We stop and dwell on the eye as Barker draws our attention to its look and feel, and thus we understand Pryor's actions and sensations. Pryor's question, related to Blunden's but substantially more dramatic, pushes readers to engage with traumatic war experience, while Blunden's actually more authentic version allows readers the same distance that Blunden requires in order to process his own nightmares. Whereas Blunden records an ordeal that a reader would certainly think affected him deeply, in keeping with the blank affect of his text, the most he can say about it, emotively, is a repetition of the refrain, Cambrai was beginning to terrify. Barker, by contrast, and with full knowledge of the way his war experience haunted Blunden for the rest of his life, can imagine the psychological effects of witnessing such horror, offering this memory as something so terrible Billy Pryor cannot help but repress it. This accords with readers' expectations when they encounter this experience in either book. Surely, if any experience is worthy of repression, this one qualifies. But Blunden's report, just another nightmare among so many, tells readers something about the war that Barker cannot capture, because she looks back on the war with a sense of the pointlessness of its many sacrifices, the everydayness of its horrors. Barker's novels, before and after the Regeneration trilogy, focus keenly on class issues, but her raising them in Regeneration helps readers look beyond the list of well-to-do writers of the Great War, favored by canon makers, to those whose class positions enable enlisted man points of view, such as Isaac Rosenberg or David Jones. Thinking about how class shapes All Quiet on the Western Front, for instance, helps students understand that classic rendition of the war as representing a particular lived experience in a place and time. And that understanding can send them to research the experiences of not only working class soldiers, but also civilians, such as the women munitions workers who feature in Barker's novel. Barker places breadcrumbs in the novel that lead readers to Wilfred Owen's letters, also used as source material in her novel. Owen is the character in the novel, and so naturally she uses his reports of meeting and working with Sassoon as background for those parts of the novel. But Owen wrote expressive and descriptive letters to his mother and others about his experiences in the war. And because Owen was not a patient of Rivers, and thus occasions for him to share the information contained in the letters are limited within the frame of the novel, Barker often gives Owen's experiences to Pryor. For example, she uses Owen's letter of January 16th, here's a picture of it, January 16th, 1917, as the basis for one of Pryor's memories. Dug out in the middle of no man's land, right? Every 48 hours, 2 platoons crawl out, nighttime, of course, relieve the poor bastards inside, and provide the Germans with another 48 hours target practice. It was flooded. You stand the whole time, most of the time in pitch darkness because the blast kept blowing the candles out. From Owen's letter, I have not been at the front. I have been in front of it. I held an advanced post, a dugout, in the middle of no man's land. My dugout held 25 men tight-packed. Water filled it to a depth of 1 to 2 feet, leaving, say, 4 feet of air. The Germans knew we were staying there and decided we shouldn't. Barker includes details like the 50-hour duration of Owen's Pryor's command at the forward post, as well as the fate of another officer, the relieving officer in Pryor's story and the commander of a second dugout in Owen's. Owen remarks that the officer was carried out of the dugout prostrated and conveyed immediately to hospital, while Pryor notes that he saw the officer on the top corridor at Craiglockhart. Readers may turn to Owen's letters initially because he is a character in the novel, but having discovered Barker's trail, they are rewarded with connections that bring the fiction to life. These modes of employing historical documents, memoirs, and poetry are typical of Barker's practice in Regeneration. For an instructor using the book in class, they provide a wonderful opportunity to enable students to discover primary texts of the Great War. Typically in class, I show examples like these to students so that they understand what kinds of things may have particular historical antecedents. I direct them to Barker's endnote detailing several sources she used in crafting the novel, such as writings by Rivers, Yelland, and critics trying to understand shell shock in its cultural context. I also provide them with access to primary sources, including excerpts from memoirs and a link to the Oxford University Great War Poetry Archive, where they can find scans of Owen's letters as well as poems like Anthem for Doomed Youth, with Sassoon's edits clearly visible. Readers become detectives, seeking the source material, and they practice comparative criticism when they examine primary sources side by side with Barker's renditions in the novel. Most students find Barker's novel easier to read and understand than the original materials. Not only is Barker's novel structured according to the ordinary rules of fiction, so that it is coherent and tells a compelling story, Barker is as aware as students are that much time has passed since the events of the Great War, and so she provides scaffolding to help readers enter her world and interpret it. The example of how Blunden's experience in Cambrin is converted into Pryor's worst nightmare is instructive. While some readers may appreciate Blunden's blank, affectless style as an enactment of shell shock, others may experience that style as inappropriate to the subject matter, and still others, missing the emotional cues of fiction, may fail to understand the horror of the experiences he narrates. Barker, on the other hand, translates her good reading of Blunden into a scene packed with the emotion his story lacks. While Blunden quickly moves on from the horror in the trench, Pryor experiences numbness all over the lower half of his face, in reaction to the terror he is experiencing. And of course, his shell shock derives from this experience, so traumatic that he represses it and can recover it only under hypnosis. Barker's third-person narration is able to observe Pryor, while Blunden cannot observe himself without also distancing himself from his emotional response. Undertones is catatonic because Blunden cannot allow himself to approach his own experiences any more directly. In a sense, that is counterintuitive, since we normally think of first-person accounts as being more authentic and as conveying more accurately the feeling of an experience. But in the case of shell shock, as Rivers notes, repression of not just memories of experiences, but also, and maybe more importantly, the emotions connected with experiences, is a symptom so common as to be ubiquitous. Of course, a limiting factor in using regeneration as a great gateway to Great War studies is that Barker, in service of historical accuracy, omits from her story writers like Rosenberg and Jones, who now figure among the major English war poets, but who were not part of the social and literary circles in which Sassoon, Graves, Blunden, and eventually Owen thrived. However, Barker, always invested in class as a point of inquiry, does include figures like Edward Marsh, who befriended Rosenberg as well as Sassoon and Rupert Brooke, so readers may find that even a quick Wikipedia search for real persons in the novel directs them toward important writers excluded from Barker's book for reasons of narrative economy. The Great War Poetry Archive also provides scans of Rosenberg's letters and manuscripts, as well as a wealth of other material readers can discover, including early drafts of David Jones's monumental work in parenthesis. In Regeneration itself, Barker introduces readers to central figures of the pacifist and homosexual rights communities, while in the second book in the trilogy, The Eye in the Door, she focuses in depth on the struggles of conscientious objectors to the war. Regeneration also sparks interest in women's various activities during the Great War, from munitions workers like Sarah Lum to VADs and professional nurses, and even to land girls, women who joined the Women's Land Army to take the place of farmers growing British food, who get a brief mention when Rivers' farmer brother Charles struggles to manage his work when the last land girl stayed only long enough to work out the distance to the nearest town before discovering that some domestic crisis required her immediate return home. Even more than among male writers, available women's accounts of the war predominantly come from the educated classes, a function of the lesser importance placed on girls' education in all classes. Making working-class munitions worker Sarah Lum a central figure whose inner life features prominently in the novel suggests to readers a wealth of primary source material to explore. Readers might also turn to well-known and resurrected memoirs by women, such as Vera Britton's Testament of Youth or Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone. Overall, then, Barker's choice to create a novel appealing to contemporary readers that is also in some ways an encyclopedia of Great War references, some overt and others more opaque, provides us with a rich resource for beginning a study of Great War literature and of the war itself. By making clear some of her historical references, such as Sassoon's and Owen's poetry or writings of Rivers and Yelland, she creates the sense within her text that nearly any interesting tidbit is likely the beginning of a rabbit trail that will lead to fascinating discovery that does not merely illumine the novel, but sheds light on the literary, medical, civil rights, and other questions of the war. Thus, we see the value of Barker's novel for contemporary readers. Like authentic memoirs of shell shock, it addresses the way the war haunts the societies it touched. But unlike them, it consciously translates the war for people whose experience of it must necessarily be secondhand at best. With the deaths of the last Great War veterans, documentary evidence like interviews, memoirs, and letters have become the only ways for people now to connect to and understand the war, but those texts can be culturally distant from contemporary readers. Barker's novel provides the service good historical novels do, transforming historical fact into an engaging story that conveys meanings through fictional narrative. I like this book, not just because it is a compelling novel in its own right, one that teaches historical incidents as it creates a fictional world, but because Barker is so clear about the sources she uses and where to find them, which makes the book a treasure chest of connection to documents that readers can track down in order to understand the war more fully. Readers who wonder about the real people and events in the novel can quickly discover the real-world antecedents of much of the novel's contents, which provides its own thrill of hunting. Like Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical dramatization of Alexander Hamilton's life, Barker's contemporary translation of the Great War opens lines of inquiry for readers of her novel, welcoming them into exploration and discovery of the interesting people and events of this most dramatic war.